Good morning. Pardon me, good afternoon. It's afternoon. I'm Jane Brennan, Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County. On behalf of the League, I thank you all for joining us today for our second Hot Topics program of the 2022-2023 year. As many of you know, prior to the pandemic, our Hot Topics programs were luncheons with guest speakers. Since the pandemic, most of the programs have been Zoom presentations. We have been both amazed and delighted at the very positive response to having these programs as Zoom meetings. As of earlier this morning, 59 people have registered for this program, which is, we think, quite a nice turnout. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization committed to promoting political responsibility through informed and active participation in government, citizenship, and elections. Our motto is making democracy work, and we do that through registering people to vote, organizing and presenting candidate forums, providing candidate information through vote411.org, and hosting educational programs such as today's hot topic program entitled Polarization, Bridging Troubled Waters, presented by Dr. James Vike, Director of the Masters of Public Administration program at Widener University. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details for this Zoom meeting. All of the participants except the guest speaker, the moderator, and our tech wizard, Kathy Youngman, will be muted. The questions submitted prior to today have been shared with the speaker. Additional questions may be submitted by way of the chat function. I will act as moderator for the Q&A questions for any that aren't covered in the presentation itself. Our speaker today is Dr. Jim Vike, Professor of Political Science at Widener University. He teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses relating to American politics and statistics. His media expertise includes the American presidency, elections, public administration, public policy, political bureaucratic relations. Jim's current research interests in bureaucratic politics examine the extent of political influence on the regulatory scope and enforcement outputs of the federal and state level regulatory agencies. His research on political engagement focuses on isolating key factors for promoting political engagement among young citizens without simultaneously triggering partisan polarization and uncivil discourse. So without further ado, I present Dr. Jim Vike.
All right, thank you very much, Jane. So great to have you guys here. So we moved on to a second screen, which is really good for me. I see I made a rookie mistake today and wore stripes. They're kind of blurring, which I've had enough experience. I shouldn't have done that. So, it's great to be back. So I presented at one of those live lunch sessions a few years back on my research, and this is an ongoing project with some new developments that I've had. So as Jane mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Widener, been there for this now my 25th year, and we've been dedicated to, for 20 of those years, to kind of promoting political engagement on campus. I have a few of my colleagues here, Sharon today, who are also engaged in that. And I'd like to, give a big shout out to the League of Women Voters, Central Delaware County, and as a national organization. Just kind of aligns really well with what we've been kind of working on at Widener, and we're really happy to have you as a community partner. As Jane mentioned, my topic for today is polarization, bridging troubled waters, and I've kind of added a little bit, in contemporary America. And we're going to start with a poll, right? So much of my research is based upon surveys, so we're going to actually run a poll, and Kathy's posted it there. If you can go ahead and respond to the poll. If you don't get it, it's a 1 to 5 question on, is political polarization a problem? So 1 being no, it's not a problem, 5 being a very big problem. If you're If you're not able to get the poll, you can go ahead and drop something in the chat, just kind of a 1 to 5 scale, just to give us a little sense of the feelings of the audience about this topic of political polarization. All right, I didn't vote. All right, now is this sharing for everyone? Kathy?
Oh,
Goodness. Let's go ahead. So let's close it down. Doesn't particularly matter that everybody gets in necessarily. I'm going to go ahead and share the results with the crowd here.
you know what? I'm going to share the. I'm going to try to share the poll again because.
Now I see it now.
Okay.
All right. So, sense of the room. Just a little bit of a margin of disagreement on pretty big problem versus very big problem, right? So what brings you here today, what we've spent a lot of time, a lot of individuals, a lot of political scientists have been focusing on is the challenge of political polarization, challenges that it's brought for society. What can we do about it? To what extent is it something that can be reconciled? To what extent is it something that has actually been exacerbated over time? So I have a presentation for you today, and it comes in a poster format, and it's very dense with content. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that, and I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to talk about a few things, and I'm going to pull away. And then a bit into this, not right away, I'm going to go ahead and just drop the poster into the chat because it's designed as something that is standalone. Right, so you can read about my research and my findings kind of on your own, share with others if you'd like. So I'm not going to be reading through all the posters, and so don't get too worried when it shows up as quite a bit of content there. All right, so let's go ahead and start with that question: is political polarization a problem? And before we quite get there, we're going to ask, well, what the heck is political polarization? What do we mean by political polarization? And how do political scientists actually describe and define? What do they mean when they talk about political polarization? All right, so I'm going to share my poster here, and I'm going to pop up and get to that particular question. All right, so how do political scientists define and measure political polarization? All right, can we see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Share, okay, all right. So the key aspect here that I want to focus on is this notion, right? There's lots of different definitions. There's ideological polarization, kind of policy viewpoint polarization, partisan polarization, candidate polarization, so forth. Lots of different ways in which scholars have looked at this notion of polarization. But one of the key defining attributes is divergence in attitudes towards the extremes. All right, so we speak to separation, right? That there's a divergence in attitudes towards the extremes. Scholars and political scientists tend to really love the American National Election Survey, which is a election year survey every kind of 2 years, right? There's a midterm survey and a general presidential election year survey in which they do pre and post election surveys of a panel of individuals and collect a tremendous amount of information on characteristics, attitudes, and their behaviors. Within this cumulative data file, which they've been running for a long time, but I look at from 2008 to 2020, there's basically 5 measures of polarization that can be used. And this is so an individual, a respondent is interviewed in September pre-election, and then they come back again and they get them and they interview them in November after the election. So there's both pre and post analysis. And within this pool of responses, there's actually 5 different kind of sets of questions that can be addressed as a polarization. The first and most common kind of historically is this notion of affinity. So there's 2 here that we're going to look at that are party polarization based, and then 3 that are candidate centered based views on polarization. So the first is party affinity polarization, which is when they ask you just, tell us about your feelings about the Republican Party on a scale of 1 to 100, with 100 being most favorable, 1 being least favorable. Tell us about your feelings towards the Democratic Party, with 1 being least favorable, 100 being most favorable. We calculate that out, we compare the two, and a polarized response is one in which there's kind of an overwhelming preference, high score for one and a low score for another, would be an indication of a party, of an individual who has expressing party polarization. The next category is party affect. Affect kind of brings in some of these feelings and a little bit of emotion, comes from the field of psychology. And the affect polarization asks you to think about what you like about the Democratic Party. So rate things that you like about the Democratic Party on a scale of 1 to 100 or 1 to 10. Then ask, what do you dislike about the Democratic Party on the scale of 1 to 10? Are there things you dislike about the Democratic Party on a scale of 1 to 10? Then we ask, what are your likes? Do you like things you like about the Republican Party on a scale of 1 to 10? Things you dislike about the Republican Party on a scale of 1 to 10. Then we combine the likes of your preferred party and the dislikes of the opposite party, and then counterbalance that with the likes of the opposite party and the dislikes of your own party. All right. So again, a polarized individual likes their own party, dislikes the other party, and doesn't really have much to say in terms of likes about the opposing party or dislikes about their own. We then look at the same thing for candidates, presidential candidates, major parties only. We do the affinity on the feeling thermometer, a scale of 1 to 100. How do you feel about the particular candidates? We counterbalance those. Affect, again, the like and dislike on a scale of 0 to 10 or 1 to 10 on terms of things that you like about this particular candidate or dislike about that. And then presidential candidates actually have an additional set of questions that speak to kind of admirable or desirable traits of candidates. And so they ask on a scale of 1 to 4, how much do you kind of agree that this individual has leadership skills, that this individual is caring about the well-being of others, that this individual is honest, that this individual is knowledgeable about the important content, right? And so they ask questions to rate your candidate or to rate your favorite candidate, and then we counterbalance that with opposing candidate, right? So 5 different measures, right? So 5 different measures that can be examined in this realm of kind of studying the extent of political polarization over time. I'm going to ask you, right? Rate yourself. We're not really going to do it, but I'm going to have you think about it, right? So you guys are concerned about polarization, highly concerned about levels of polarization, but to what extent are you polarized, right? So to what extent do you have, so think about your feelings towards your favorite party, if you have a favorite party. And what's kind of funny about the political scientists, the ones that study, is that if you say, I'm purely independent, they just like throw you out of they say, okay, we don't want to look at you. We just want to look at people who are partisans. So to what extent would you rate your favorite party on a scale of 1 to 100? To what extent would you rate your least favorite, right? Is there a big gap there? Then you would come up as polarized on that question. To what extent about the presidential candidates? We can go 2020, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We go back to 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama, right? So to what extent is your favorite candidate rated much higher than your least favorite, than the other candidate, right? In that case, you're expressing polarization, right? Now, what about likes? Are there things you like about the Democratic Party on a scale of 1 to 10? Are there things you dislike about the Republican or the Democratic Party? Are there things you like about the Republican Party? Are there things you dislike about the Republican Party? So to the extent that you can't really, you can express likes, but feel uncomfortable about dislikes of your favorite party, and to the extent that you can't express things you like about the other party or the other candidate, right? So then again, you're actually coming through the system as polarized, right? So in those 4 categories, and then there's the likes and dislikes, or the candidate trait. I like going back to 2008, 2012, right? A polarized individual can't say anything nice about Barack Obama, right? Can't say anything that's kind of they don't like about John McCain, right? So that would be a polarized Republican perspective. An individual, right? So if we go to, right, is there nothing? Could you, is John McCain, if you like Barack Obama, is John McCain not a good leader? Is John McCain not an honest individual, or so forth, right? So if you can't actually say something nice about somebody else, right? And even kind of something kind of, less than nice about your own favorite candidate, then again, you're polarized. All right. So in my research, I actually combine all 5 of them. And I look at every individual across each of these 5 categories, right? So it's possible for me to be, polarized when it comes to my candidate trait assessments, but I'm not so polarized when it comes to the parties, right? Maybe I have, I'm medium on both of them, but I like one candidate and I really dislike another candidate, or so forth. Then I'm kind of partial polarized, right? Not for all of my expressions, all right? So you don't need to share. You can pop it in the chat if you have some particular feelings on that, and we'll get to it. The next thing, next item we go to is, so we've got these 5 things, right? And we're looking at candidate trait assessment, or polarization measures across these, or the extent of polarization across these 5 different questions. I want to spend a little time talking about political science, right? The political science literature. And they're in the area of polarization. There's 2 different kind of general tendencies in the polarization literature. So one, there's near consensus on increasing polarization, right? So we kind of all know this, and the political sciences scholars have kind of affirmed this, that there is more polarization now than there used to. There's fairly uniform agreement. There's overwhelming agreement among political elites that our politicians are much more polarized now than they used to be. There's some disagreement on the extent to which this is a problem among the mass public, and there's substantial disagreement and scholarly work on the root causes and consequences. Okay? There's fairly common and frequent assertions that heightened levels of polarization is associated with greater levels of interest and political engagement. All right. I'm going to stop the share for a second, come back and think about this question. Right? So there's research that says polarization, the more polarized you are, the more likely you are to participate. This poses a significant problem for us as educators and the League of Women Voters. How do we mobilize people to be informed and participants in democratic society? Easy. We just push them towards polarization and favoring one party over the other. It's easy, right? But we don't really want to do that. So is it possible to promote political engagement and inform civil discourse and so forth without actually exacerbating political polarization in society? So the second general conclusion, or the approach, is that the scholars study aggregates. All right, they look at, every year they go out and they look at, so what's the extent of polarization in America? They say there's more polarization now than there used to be, right? They typically pick 1 measure or 2 measures at most, and they make sweeping assertions about the extent of polarization in society, right? Say America is more polarized than it used to be. Yes, true. However, this precludes the possibility of individuals holding what I call kind of complex set of viewpoints across a range of topics, right? And it leads us to kind of make generalizations that flag aggregate tendencies as absolutes. We have more polarization now than we used to. Polarized individuals participate more than non-polarized individuals. So we only focus on the polarization. One key, and actually I'm going to stop share this because I want you guys to participate in this one. And the final kind of general topic that is one that kind of concerns me and which has driven my particular area of research currently is this notion of framing. How do we frame this notion of polarization? Most of the polarization scholars just look at polarization on a spectrum. And they say, we are more polarized now than we used to. Or back then we were less polarized. So they just think of polarization as a more or less phenomenon. Or they think about it as high levels of polarization or low levels of polarization, right? So just thinking about in the aggregate, how polarized is society? There's nothing other than polarization. There's just more polarization or less polarization, right? So then if we think about, some scholars actually look at individual levels, and those individuals try to create some categories, and they say there are polarized individuals. And they have two categories, some have two categories of people who are non-polarized, right? So in this regard, they're speaking to kind of polarized as this one-sided viewpoint, right? I'm polarized, I can only favor one party or the other, I only favor one candidate over the other. Right? So if we think about what are the categories for people who aren't polarized, and they have two. One is indifference. And we all know that those folks are out there, right? That's a fairly decent category. We know that there are people out there who are disinterested, disengaged. They don't really care about politics. They're not participating. We want to work on them, but we recognize, okay, right? So that's a good category. The next category, however, is ambivalence, which is defined as kind of the capacity or it's a condition in which you are holding competing viewpoints on something within your ambivalence. All right, so I'd like you to drop in the chat. We're going to do a little word association real quick. I want you to do a word association. Ambivalence. What words pop up? Is ambivalence a positive association? Is ambivalence a pejorative? Let's go ahead and open up the chat. What strikes you? Mixed feelings, non-interest, doesn't care. If someone is ambivalent about something, right? So if you say, I want to go to a movie, you want to go see this particular movie, and someone goes, I'm ambivalent. You go, oh, okay, guess we're not going to go to that movie, right? You say, hey, who would like chicken for dinner tonight? And you go, oh, I'm ambivalent. You say, well, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming gubernatorial election, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? You go, oh, I'm ambivalent. You go, oh, are you going to vote? Right? Undecided, irresponsible, so forth, right? So thank you for sharing. So in my understanding, right, there is, right, so the general populace understanding of ambivalence leans towards the pejorative side, that it's actually kind of indecisive. You can't decide, all right? Actually, it gets a little bit worse even, because in the psychology realm, share again, in the psychology realm, at worst, ambivalence is regarded as a malady. It's a sickness. It's a condition that creates dissonance within our head, which we are compelled to fix. All right, so let's just think about that for a second. We all kind of recognize, or many of us, most of us actually said we think that polarization is a real problem, and we'd like to see less polarization. But if the political science literature can only regard the alternative as a sickness that needs to be cured, what are we doing? Right? Is there something, right? Would we champion someone as being non-polarized participant, but then we tell them that they're sick and that you have to be polarized? All right. So that's where in my literature, my paper that I have working on, I'm speaking to Beyond Ambivalence is the topic. I'm trying to come up with a different framing for this non-polarized viewpoint, which I think is really crucial. All right, so just going to present a little bit on my research now. And move this guy over here. I think there's some real unique features to the ongoing research that I have. First, I'm the first to kind of look at individual level polarization across all 5 of these different measures, and actually trying to get into an individual and see to what extent are they polarized across these measures. Then I introduce a new framework for polarization. This new framework actually gives greater complexity and nuance to the distribution. the framework identifies people as being fully polarized, in which they are expressing polarization in all of those, across all of those measures. There's a partially polarized individual who expresses a substantive amount of polarization, but not across all 5 measures. It might have several in which they're regarded as kind of balanced opinions, and some, at least one, where they are favoring another side. And then I create a new middle category, of which I kind of as a grab bag of balanced and mixed reviews, right? What about the people that hate both parties? What about the people that hate both candidates, right? They're kind of in that indifferent category, but they have, you know, balanced views at least, right? So what about individuals that kind of can regard and express some positive sentiments about the other opposing party or the opposing candidates or so forth? So I introduced these 5 different categories. I think by looking at this and then by examining it in terms of political engagement, I've actually exposed some overstated connections between polarization and political engagement. And then I think my model actually offers some hope. All right. First findings are pretty bad, right? But within those findings, there's some hope that we can actually, that the type of work that we want to be involved in can actually lead to some positive outcomes that generate a stronger civil participating society. So here's the data that I have, right? And so this data I've taken 4 years of the national election data, which comes out to 18,000 respondents, right? So 18,000 individuals actually responded enough to these different questions over this span of time. So 18,000 respondents, I break them down, every individual one of them, and I look to what extent are they polarized across each of the, are they expressing a polarized viewpoint across each of these 5 categories. And then I broke it down by time. So 18,000 respondents. And what we can see here is that in 2008, half of the respondents were falling into that balanced or mixed category. And we can see a pretty significant reduction, right? To 2020, we see only 23% are saying that they're in that balanced category. We can see on the extremes, the fully polarized. So the fully polarized is in all 5 categories, or 4 if they only did 4. They expressed a polarized viewpoint, favoring one party or one candidate. All right. So an increase from 14 to 26%, an increase from 8 to 23% among Republicans. Pretty strong evidence of a fractured, polarized electorate in the 2020 election, right? We see 50% of the respondents are actually expressed as fully polarized. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. That's alarming. That's definitely worthy of attention or so forth. What's kind of interesting is 2016. You guys remember 2016? You would think 2016 was a polarizing election, right? But in actuality, 2016 didn't see any increases in the fully polarized expression. There's a little key to that. Lots of people hated both of the candidates, right? So, but by 2020, it had gotten sorted out, right? So that they're favoring one candidate or another, expressing any type of doubts or weakness about your favorite candidate, not allowed anymore, right? You know, so 2020 really highlights some big issues. I like, you know, so I acknowledge that and I address that. But I also like to acknowledge that, well, 50% were fully polarized in 2020. That means 50% weren't, right? A quarter of the individuals were in this balanced or mixed category. There were quite a few people who were partially polarized, who had clear expressions in favorability, but were willing to say something nice about the opposing party or had some qualms about their own party or so forth, right? They were willing to hold competing viewpoints in their mind. I don't think these people are sick, right? I think these people deserve a new category, and I'm calling it balanced or mixed. And then I think that actually going in there and looking at these individuals, right? What do these people, do they participate? Are they engaged? Right? So some additional research that I've looked at is to look at the partisan distribution, right? So strength of partisan attachment. So they ask, you know, what party do you affiliate with, Democrat, Independent, or Republican? If you say Democrat or Republican, they say, well, how strong would you say your attachment? Is it strong or not so strong? Which then becomes a weak partisan if you say not so strong. And then they ask if you're an independent. If you say I'm an independent, then they go, well, would you lean to one party or the other? And if you express that you lean to one party or the other, then you're called a leaner. And they take those weak partisans and the leaners and they put them together. And the research finds that they're quite similar to them. All right. So even if you say you're independent, but if you lean to one party, you're an awful lot like a weak partisan. All right. So we break them into three categories. As we can see, the strong partisans, fully democratically polarized, predominantly strong partisans, fully Republican polarized, predominantly strong partisans. Independents, people who say, no, I'm an independent, right? They aren't polarized, right? They fall into this middle. A lot of them are indifferent or disengaged. We have to acknowledge that. But then individuals say they're weak or leaners, we actually see a ton of them in here, right? So that strength of partisan attachment is really important. We also see that there's a few people who say they're strong partisans who are in this balanced category as well. So it's not as, if there's clearly a statistically significant association, but it's not as kind of surefire, generalized as you might think. This next chart over here to the right, I have three stacked histograms. We're looking at two factors and combining two factors and questions from the ANS survey that indicate kind of the extent to which you are likely to be politically active and engaged. One is about your attentiveness to political topics. You know, how attentive are you? And to what extent are you concerned for election outcomes? Meaning that you think it's important that it matters the party, which party is in power, who holds power, right? So concern for election outcomes. These two have been kind of historically shown as really important in terms of predicting whether someone votes or whether someone's engaged, right? So a disinterested person isn't attentive to politics, and they might be disaffected. They might say it doesn't matter, you know, my vote doesn't matter, it doesn't really matter who's in charge, right? So what we can see is I've stacked these histograms. At the top, we have the fully polarized, and the fully polarized, you can see, is very far to the right, right? Fully polarized individuals, they think they are attentive to politics on the most part, and they think electoral outcomes are important, right? That's kind of, we want to, if we're trying to get some young people to vote or whatever, elections matter. Pay attention to politics, right? We want you to be informed. So we can see the partially polarized individuals are still to the right, but just less so, right? So they're maybe not as attentive, maybe don't quite see as much in terms of their aggregate. So the mean is to the right. It's where we see the balanced individuals on this kind of perfect little kind of smooth normal curve with the mean right in here at the midpoint, right? So a little less attentive on average and lesser levels of kind of concern for the who's in power. All right, I think it's a little less different. Sometimes you kind of go, you know, particularly in years past, and that might be the right answer. But what I want to point out also is it's not an absolute. You don't read this and say fully polarized people are engaged, partially polarized people are not engaged, are partially engaged, and mixed or balanced people are not engaged. That's not actually true, right? If you look at the distribution, you see there's a lot of people in the mixed or balanced here who are actually at high levels. They're very attentive, and they are, you know, very concerned about electoral outcomes. And there's actually people up here in the fully polarized who aren't particularly attentive, who don't particularly think it's matter. So they're polarized, but they're not paying attention. I have some additional output that shows kind of electoral campaign engagement. And again, fully polarized, more engaged, partially polarized, less engaged, the lowest of the engagement levels. But there are people who are in that balanced category who participate much more than people who are fully polarized. And one of the keys to the fully polarized is that they don't actually some of them don't actually participate, right? All right, so I'm going to go just a couple more minutes and kind of describe for us some of the lessons that we might take from this, and to try to get to a few of the questions that were addressed, and then we'll leave time for open questions and Jane will pose some more questions to me that I hopefully can address. All right, so useful lessons. So most of the people that study polarization lament it, right? They say it's a problem. And some say we need to do something about it. What can we do about it? My initial research, I hope to kind of change the world of political science a little bit and say, okay, how about we stop denigrating individuals who don't engage in individual levels of polarized expression. All right, so that's one of my big things. So key challenges for those of us trying to mobilize engagement in a civil manner, right? How do we mobilize engagement among those disaffected or disinterested in politics, right? We've got to try to emphasize that politics matters. We've got to try to emphasize that, get them interested, show how politics impacts your life, get them informed, get them educated. We need to also acknowledge, however, that sometimes they're disaffected. Sometimes they've been turned off, or sometimes they go, look at politics, man. It's just everybody flaming everybody else. I don't want to be a part of it. All right. So civil discourse and bringing down that tone of polarization can help to bring that back, I think. Then how do we encourage those with existing high levels of engagement to adopt a more civil or less polarized orientation in their political behaviors, right? So what about those people who are participating, but are engaged in very polarized behaviors and attitudes? And so that's where kind of some of my research and some of the things we've been doing at Widener come to play. So it's really important to engage in these traditional, political engagement mechanisms like voter registration drives, get out the vote drives. You guys sponsor candidate forums and information guides, and you bring people in to share information, right? You guys on your wonderful hot topics list, you have things about educate people about ballot security, and you have information on candidates. I mean, just a wonderful array of sharing information. But I think we need some more, right? I think we need, and I'm just going to stop sharing here for a second and kind of be done with the share. I think we need some training modules. And at Widener, we have a few training modules, and we need to try to build them to scale, because it doesn't happen just naturally. People don't know how to engage in civil discourse, particularly in a society that seems to be everybody's just flaming on one another. What do most people do that don't want to participate? They just avoid it, right? So one of our questions was about this topic of avoidance, right? So on Thanksgiving, well, if you've got a family on Thanksgiving that has different political views, it's off limits, man. We can't talk about politics. But when can we talk about politics? Never. We're never going to talk about politics, right? So that's destructive, right? So we need to be able to talk about it and teach people how to engage in it in a manner that doesn't lead to the right answer is to avoid it, right? So we need to have some training modules. We need to teach people how to facilitate civil discussions. At Widener, we've had this ongoing process of debate watches. We bring in students. We watch the presidential debates on the TV and so forth. We have live chats. We have people kind of chiming in, so forth. We set some ground rules on what's acceptable to put in. Usually have the students be the ones to kind of police the ground rules on that. But then we also train facilitators, student discussion facilitators. We teach them how to have a civil discussion on important topics. And after the debates, we go to breakout sessions. And we have students who've been trained lead discussions. And we've attempted to kind of have this ongoing training. It's not something that people just kind of know how to do. How do you get people to talk about tough and difficult topics, right? So if you think about as a political scientist in my policy class, am I going to bring up abortion in a constitutional law class or a public policy class? It's easiest to just kind of avoid it, right? This might make people uncomfortable. People might, but you need to be able to have some training on how to facilitate civil discussions. And then also there's this notion we're kind of embrace this kind of empathy and understanding. We have to set up a way in which individuals can collect information about others and viewpoints of others in a respectful way that they can develop some empathy and understanding about someone else's viewpoint. And we have a technique known as a table talk, which is not a discussion. It's actually just a facilitated, one-sided interchange where there is a person who is asking questions, drawing out individuals' opinions on topics, thoughts about candidates, thoughts about policies, and so forth. And it ultimately, it's awkward for many people because you don't kind of chime back in. You don't say, well, that's wrong, right? That's wrong, or, oh, I agree with you, or so forth, right? So we sometimes get in these opinion bubbles where everybody agrees with everybody else, right? And it's so fun. Went to book club and we all agreed on everything, and it was so fun, and we made fun of the other side and everything, and it was great, right? And you go, well, what if you have some different viewpoints at book club? Oh, book club would be terrible, right? If we had different political groups. Okay, well, how about we dedicate book club to learning about others, right? And we need to be trained to do that, right? So that's my big push. I think in terms of the question we had about avoidance, we need to train people on how to go about finding out, so crazy Uncle Sal has some views. How can we talk to crazy Uncle Sal and find out why does crazy Uncle Sal have those views? And crazy Uncle Sal, tell me about your political experiences and so forth, and tell me about that. Maybe without drinking, that would be good. So we don't have the drinking on Thanksgiving before we talk to Uncle Sal. But we have to train people on how to do that, right? And then civil discussion, civil discourse, you guys know it. I mean, it's about ground rules, right? You have to have some kind of capacity to establish respectful ground rules ahead of time, teach people how to do that. And most of our sessions are, just great, right? So people, and then the table talk, we ask them, well, do you have anything you want to say at the end of the table talk? And what almost everybody says is, that has strong views, they say, this was great. I very rarely get an opportunity to actually share without someone either just agreeing with me or coming right back at me, and so forth. And you often find that people have nuanced opinions. Everybody isn't just this monolith, and so forth. So the big value for it is not for the person answering the questions, but it is for the facilitator to learn how to do that. All right. So I am done with my presentation.
Okay, I have some questions here for you, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay, one of the first ones we received was, as the wave of Generation Z folks become more active as political candidates, how will they affect our current polarized political environment?
Can you restate, as the wave
Sure.
of
Generation Z, Gen Z folks become active as political candidates, how will they affect our current polarized political environment? What will be the effect of Gen Z people?
So obviously, I work a lot with young people. We've participated in activities with what's called the National Study of Learning and Voting. It's up at Tufts University now. Focus on trying to get people to participate. Young people, some are kind of disconnected and disengaged. What we have found at Widener and other is that there's a lot who are very interested when they experience our trainings. So when we're fortunate at Widener, we have a fairly diverse set of political viewpoints. So we're not, a school that just has all of one type of political views among our students. So we actually find that the students are quite receptive to it. We try to teach, in addition to kind of this empathy and understanding, we have a module on expression and advocacy, how to try to get what you want, right? So what we try to teach them is that there's the, I don't know if you guys remember Footloose, but there's the time to pray and there's the time to dance, right? And so elections and big votes and so forth, those are the times to dance, right? So election day is not about civil discourse and discussion. Election day is about trying to get your people out there to vote, right? And in the campaigns are trying to get people to vote. They will express some negative, run some negative ads and so forth. So we need to kind of also say, but that doesn't have to be all the time, right? And so our students have been pretty receptive to it. and several of them have gone on into the world and so forth, and we try to instill in them. You can be a strong, passionate advocate for your topic. Just remember to rein it in on stuff that is outside of that context of winning today. It's disparaging of others. We try to emphasize, respect and well-being for others. And I think the younger students, some of the world speaks to this notion of tolerance, right? So Gen Z has much higher levels of kind of tolerance for differing views and differing characteristics and circumstances and so forth. So I think we're in pretty good shape. I think there's this danger of having them get turned off and disaffected, right? So if you jump into the system, you want to change the world, and then you get, you get smacked right in the face. It might be that you say, well, actually, politics isn't for me, right? So I know I kind of went off on that one a little bit.
But, well, that was helpful. What issues tend to be the least or the most contentious entry points for conversations across differences?
So in terms of, so if we think about the difference, and there's this notion of negative partisanship, so in the, which is rather than actually really a lot of the polarization is about disliking the other side more so than liking your own, right? So that's this notion of negative partisanship. And so we see a lot of that, and I see that there's a comment from Jack in there about the elites and the politicians or so forth who are fostering these kind of feelings about negativity towards the other side. I know that a lot of people see, the only time they ever see Tucker Carlson is when they see clips of Tucker Carlson on MSNBC. The only people that ever see anything that Marjorie Taylor Greene or AOC said was when they're watching some other program that's saying, look at this thing that this person said, right? So there's a lot of people that benefit from that and encourages the society. And so I think it's right now more so than certain issues, right? So obviously abortion is a really big one. It's just the general feeling of us versus them. So the biggest polarizing feature is them right now, right? Just kind of generically, oh, look what they wanted. Right. And I've heard quite a bit, people in my community, they talk about they're threatening our way of life. What do you mean by your way of life? Right. And, so it's a little bit more generic than some of the issues, although, the abortion topic is certainly a big
one. And we've had a couple of questions about how could you share the training modules, that they seem like such a wonderful tool?
So, I mean, we've been trying for a while. It's ultimately we get to, so when we do the debate watches, we build a cohort of students. I've had a class that we've identified and so forth. But to kind of build to scale, I think we need a grant. I think we'd have to, bring in our student life. Ultimately, my goal, which I've, is to have some type of certification, right? So you've gone through it, because you have to actually exercise it, right? So you can go to a training class that teaches you about how to facilitate a civil discussion. You need to actually do it and get review and feedback, and then do it again and do it again and so forth. So we have a series of training modules. We used to have a leadership certificate program that I participated in several of these along. I've got lots of different colleagues that work on this issue. So I'd like to try to build it to scale a bit, to a small scale, to get more students involved, to have it be more systematized. We have a thing called a Garner program and a student leader program at Widener that we could establish as part of a training. But ultimately, it has to be kind of an online thing. LinkedIn Learning with some demonstrated, so it does take financial resources and an ongoing commitment to kind of build it out.
Is there some way that we, the League of Women Voters, could access the training, especially as we register folks to vote and encourage them to vote?
Sure. I mean, I have a couple of video things. I might have to look at them to see to what extent I'm. So one of the problems when I create videos, I tend to make them contemporary, and I talked specifically to my audience, so I don't go to, so I may be talking to them about what we, in the middle of the video, I might be talking to them about what we talked about in class last, a couple days ago or something like that, So, but yeah, I think that would be a wonderful furtherance of the collaboration with Widener Political Engagement and League of Women Voters. I'd love that. And I know you guys have, great content and existing programming on that. So everything doesn't have to reinvent the wheel.
We had a question on, are there specific bylaws or mission statements for the Democratic and Republican parties?
The Republican Party didn't actually even establish a nationwide platform in 2020. They just kind of went with their 2016 one. Right now it's about winning. We want to win so we have power. And, right now, as you guys know, 50-50 Senate, 5-vote spread in the House, right? Gubernatorial elections that are like tooth and nail and so forth. It's right now, it's about winning and gaining power. Why? So we can have power. But what do you want to do if you have power? Well, we want to have more power if we, and continue to stay in office. So we're so evenly divided electorally at a nationwide level right now, and within the federal level, that it's just about winning. And you can't, you pick a policy topic that you want to advocate for just because you think it's going to help you, right? So you go with, immigration coming out, and if you guys are watching the ads from Dr. Oz and Fetterman and so forth. It's like, let's try crime, let's try inflation, let's try immigration or whatever. And so, it's all about winning right now.
As we learned that all politics are local, there is a new push to get more polarized candidates elected in school boards and local councils. Do you think that COVID accelerated based on the 2021 elections in New Jersey and in Virginia?
So I would say the old sage of all politics is local has been beaten over the head with what's called the nationalization of politics now. And I don't know how many of you saw it, but I know in my community there were a few school board candidates who were young, recent college graduates who were campaigning on transgender student scholarships and playing in sports and restrooms and critical race theory and so forth, which were like not a thing in the school district, but they were participating in these national training things and trying to mobilize young people and so forth. So to the extent that many of these programs are about nationalization, they're a national program which they're trying to educate and encourage students that want to participate, and they bring them into these programs and teach them about these kind of national issues, and then they take the national issues to their local government. I'm sure you guys have experienced some folks who run for local office on a kind of national platform, and then they get into office and they go, oh, it's not about this. So we're talking about the budget. Oh man, I hate this, right? And they kind of drop out after 2 years, right? And they don't fulfill their term and so forth. So the notion of young people getting involved, I think, is great. I think Zoom and technology has made, I think local governments now have a lot more people participating and being aware of videos and so forth. So it's easier to be kind of informed about what's going on in your local community. And so, but in terms of, running for office, I think more will be. There are some national programs to encourage them and so forth. And then they have to learn that sometimes you get smacked in the face and you gotta get back up and go do it again.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about how has polarization among young women voters affected healthcare and healthcare equality?
So how could polarization among
how could polarization among young women voters affect healthcare and healthcare equality?
So I would say that one of the challenges, right? And so if you think about polarization, divergence of attitudes, right? Okay. And so among women, right, there's certain issues that it's kind of this expectation that you would have, say, women would have common interests on healthcare access for women, say, right? And you would say, but what has happened is you would then take polarization, and polarization diverges a group, right? And they talk about cleavages, right? So you take a group and you separate it, right? And so abortion's a big issue, right? So the strongest kind of advocates for, pro-choice position are women. And the strongest advocates for pro-life position are women, right? So it isn't this kind of uniform thing. And so polarization hinders that, right? So when you take a group and you cleave them, and then they start kind of, their attitudes are more in opposition to one another than thinking about common interests.
What public policy issues do you believe could garner bipartisan support?
I think there's a number of them. I did some political commentary after the most recent kind of legislation, and you saw big news yesterday. Mitch McConnell is supporting electoral vote count act change. Right? I mean, there's a bunch of them, right? And what I think is most important is do the work, right? So our legislative entities have to get the work done, right? You got to pass the budget. You got to fund programs. You got to, fix the roads. You got to, so there's a bunch of things. And if we agree on it and we work together on it, no one ever talks about it, right? So one of the modules that I'm trying to have in development is this notion of negative news, right? I mean, the news, the coverage, it's only about that which is polarizing. That's the only thing they talk about, right? So Congress, when you actually go, well, gosh, Congress never does anything. And then you look and you go, well, actually, they passed a whole bunch of stuff, right? Some of it, 95 to 5 in the Senate. Some of it, 50 to 50 with the vice president voting. Those are the ones that we focus on. But there's a lot of other things. So I think there's a ton of issues in which we have common agreement. I think they're part of what kind of we're talking about is this notion of conflict resolution, right? So an additional kind of training type of thing, which we don't have to do, but to me, it's akin to, so this how to engage in civil discourse, how to lead a facilitated discussion, very similar to kind of conflict resolution training. And one of the keys to conflict resolution training is common interests, right? So what do we, so we focus on, we are apart because we are apart, but what is it that we agree on? And what is it that we can work together on? And I think it's hindered by electoral, by the closeness of the electoral outcomes, right? So no Republican wants to work with Joe Biden and the Democrats, even on an issue that they might care about, because it might actually help Joe Biden and help the Democrats to win elections. And we don't want that, right? And so anyway.
We had a question about how can one discuss things that are actual lies, such as stolen election? How
Right.
can you discuss that civilly?
So that's actually one of the, so the table talks thing I mentioned, right? So if I'm a table talker and you're a respondent, we're just talking. I'm asking you questions. I'm asking you what you care about, politics, political issues, candidates, or so forth. I let your responses, right? So if you talk about a candidate, I let you kind of go. If you want to talk about Dr. Oz, we talk about what do you like about Dr. Oz and so forth, and what are the different features. If you want to talk about education funding, we'll talk about education funding and why and so forth. Within the approach is a little effort to, there's kind of a classic conflict resolution or civil discourse is to ask, what are things that you don't like? So you like Dr. Oz, what is there anything about Dr. Oz that you don't like? Is there anything about, Senator Fetterman or Lieutenant Governor Fetterman that you do like, right? To try to get them to acknowledge and break down a little bit. So the lies, and that's one of the things that the table talks, you don't confront, right? It's a technique, we're doing this. So if someone is spouting lies, something you believe not to be true, you go with it and you dig deeper into it and you find out why, where did you get that information? And tell me more about that. And how does that make you feel? And is there anything that you can get in there a little bit? And is there anything, have you seen, anything that's questioning that or so forth? But you have to suspend that confrontation. Now, it's not for everybody. It's not for all the time, but it actually what it does is it sometimes roots in, why is someone saying that, right? So, and do they really believe it? Are they saying it? I've heard, a ton of elected officials talk about trying to talk to people, and they kind of convince them that the election was free and fair and the votes were counted properly, and people kind of go, okay, and then they walk away, and then they see them the next day and they're back on track, right? So that's a hard one. So the table talks are not a forever thing. It's not a, so there is time to address issues. When we have topics that are kind of, someone is obviously kind of giving some information that's just not accurate or so forth. If you're facilitating a discussion, you kind of, you can kind of throw a little bit of doubt onto that. And unless there's a desire, right? Sometimes people just kind of shut down, and there's a desire, okay, well, let's move on to a different topic.
Kind of related to that, we have a question about, are there any don't even go there, don't even bother topics, that it's just not worth your energy trying to negotiate or navigate with people?
So, I mean, and that's, some of that, yeah, so I would say the entrenched party lines, right? So this is, so you have to break that down, right? So part of if you're talking about a discussion, you get, rather than just kind of saying, this is what they say, and this is what they say, and bang, 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 right? Is you try to get away from those kind of issues and try to get to some of the underlying motivations and some of the values and ideals. And for me, in a facilitated discussion is trying to talk about common interest and values. And if you're trying to have a discussion about school board people, and somebody just wants to talk about transgender bathrooms, and somebody else wants to talk about other things, it's like you can kind of get to a discussion where you're talking about why do we care about the school board, and what do we want from our schools, and what are our common interests, and so forth. And you can get people to kind of agree on valuable education for our students is good, and we can kind of get people to recognize that oh, okay, we kind of agree that we want our students to be well trained in reading and math, and have a safe environment, and so forth.
Thank you. There's one other question that somebody submitted about, now you talked about what your research looks at. Is there other political data that looks at local and regional educational and economic, or even climate factors?
So in the larger, so most of the national level stuff that looks at polarization is big multivariate regression, where they include tons of stuff, right? So they will include all of the demographic factors, economic class factors, religious background, and so forth. So they can include, the American National Election Study has just a ton of information about every respondent. So at the national level, you can definitely break down and control for all of those different types of factors, right? You can look at age, you can break it down by education level, by income level, by, so you can control a ton of that. In terms of the, national climate, it's a real challenge, right? So there's just, we see a lot of it just kind of nationwide polls, and there's a real challenge with nationwide polls now, and that it's hard to get a good representative sample, and you can't ask too many questions, and it's just a snapshot in time and can't really be analyzed as thoroughly on the methodology. So the ANES methodology is tight, right? They've got it figured out, and it's very reliable, and so forth. In terms of state and local, I mean, I saw you guys had, oh gosh, I've completely forgotten his name, but does the Keystone poll, right?
Terry Madonna, you mean?
Yeah. So I mean, there's pockets, right? So Monmouth has that, right? Where there's pockets where you have kind of people dedicated to state and local, where you can get more information, so forth. Locals just like really difficult to collect a lot of information about, to be able to do impact analysis like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim. This has been a very stimulating presentation and hopeful, I think. And the idea of the training modules that are available and the work you're doing with students is, for me, very uplifting, and I'm sure for the rest of our audience. For the audience in general, before you leave, I have a couple of announcements to make about our upcoming events. We have some dealing with voter registration. We have 2 more Hot Topics programs upcoming, and we have a candidate forum. So let me give you the dates for those. Next Friday, we will have another Hot Topics presentation, and that one will focus on what buying elections, what you should know about campaign finance. And that's next Friday on Zoom at 12 p.m. And then we have another Hot Topics program on October 14th, and that's the one with Terry Madonna, and it will discuss the 2020 midterm election. We also have several voter registration activities coming up. Tomorrow at Subaru Park, there will be a voter registration program at the Chester River Festival. On October 8th, there will be voting matters at the Vittles Food Hall, another opportunity to register people. And the program is called Chester City Rocks. And then on October 10th at 7 p.m., we are sponsoring a congressional forum, or a candidate forum, for the congressional contest between Mary Gay Scanlon and David Galuch. So, and all of this information is available on our website, which is lwvcdc.org. So again, I thank you, Jim, for a very interesting and stimulating and hopeful presentation. And I thank all of our attendees. Have a good afternoon. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.